My name's Andrew Cox. I manage MLA's Japan and Korea teams based in Tokyo, and from January I'll be moving to Singapore to take over all of our overseas offices. The session for today is titled Navigating the Complex Global Trading and Marketing Environment, and I'm lucky to be joined by two gentlemen to my left here who know all about the trading environment, both from the political sphere and the commercial sphere. Before I switch to these two gents, I'll just start by covering a little bit from my perspective about the state of the global markets at the moment, the global consumer, and how we can build Australia's brand equity. So the key point really up front is that global demand is growing faster than we can supply it. However, the trade is increasingly volatile. As I'm sure Andrew Robb will mention, economic expansion is slowing. We have the Brexit and EU situation. We've got trade frictions between China and the US, and we have African swine fever, which is wreaking havoc on some of our global markets for protein. And also competition is fierce. So Australian beef and lamb over many decades has built a very strong country of origin presence in our key markets. But increasingly, we're joined by well-organised competitors jostling for position and with their own organised marketing campaigns. That's just for beef and lamb, not to mention, of course, increase in poultry production, pork production, and, of course, the alternative proteins. And Australia really is a small producer in the global context. We produce just 4% of the globe's beef and 5% of the globe's sheep meat. So we're not in a position to supply the whole globe. So although demand's increasing, we're not in a position to supply it. So what we need to do is find a way to target those consumers who matter. And how do we do that? Well, we need to collect data and insights about those consumers. So one way we can do that is just looking at the hard data. We know that consumers won't look at importing beef until their household income reaches about $35,000. So we know globally that we can identify and target those wealthier consumers, relatively wealthier consumers, and target them. We also know from our own market research and insight gathering that country of origin and provenance is absolutely key for the global beef consumer. We're talking about our consumers living in countries who import a lot of food and consumers who have had numerous health scares. So country of origin becomes of the utmost importance, and that's why we back the country of origin labelling schemes such as True Aussie Beef and True Aussie Lamb. Another insight is young, upwardly mobile consumers in Ho Chi Minh City, in Singapore, in Seoul, in Jakarta, probably have more in common with one another than they do with the more traditional lower income consumers in their own homelands. And that means that they're interested in consuming food based on global trends. So the pictures that you see behind me here all have two things in common. One of them would be immediately obvious, is that they're all major Japanese restaurant chains. But there's another thing they have in common which would not, I guess, be immediately apparent to you, and that's that none of those restaurants are in Japan. So I sent an email out to our global offices a couple of weeks ago, and within 24 hours they collected these photos of chain restaurants in other parts of Asia, in the Middle East, and in the US. So these global consumers, upwardly mobile consumers, are increasingly interested in consuming food which is in line with their global trends, and I think that's a good opportunity for Australian beef. We also know that looking at the relatively wealthier consumers, as affluence increases, people will seek products that align with their values, and that's certainly something that we see in the global protein market domestically as well. The wealthier consumers will seek to buy products that align with their own moral values. So why is this all important to you? Well, ultimately, consumer choice is dictated by the affinity that a consumer feels for a brand. And this is a stark illustration on the slide here. You can see this is a Korean supermarket in Seoul. You can see Australian beef and our key competitor in Korea right next to each other, around the same price, around the same specifications. So a Korean consumer needs to make a decision about whether they choose the one on the left or the one on the right. Obviously, we want them to choose the one on the left, but they won't do that, all other things being equal, unless they have some kind of brand affinity with our product. And I'd like to sort of bring that together with one case study before I pass over to Andrew Robb. When I first moved to Japan in 2014-15, our largest customer in Japan had a major food safety issue, McDonald's Japan. Japan is McDonald's second largest global market after their home base in the US. And they had a food safety issue, not anything to do with beef, but actually to do with chicken in a China-based factory. But because of that issue, they lost 50% of their foot traffic overnight. And those consumers were not willing to return to a company that a lot of them had lost faith with. Obviously, while it had nothing to do with their beef supply chain, it had a major influence on Australian beef. McDonald's, actually, Japan takes 10% of our volumes to Japan. It's by far our largest customer, and probably our largest overseas customer of all by volume. So their problem was our problem. What we were able to do, leveraging the great trust that's been built in Australian beef in Japan over many decades, was approach McDonald's and suggest that we work together to help them restore trust in their brand by utilising the trust that their consumers, their customers have in our product. So starting in 2015 with some tray mats, you can probably see some of my hamburger stains on that one. That's an actual tray mat that goes in the tray at McDonald's. We took them to Australia, shot some scenes on farm, shot some scenes in plant, and then in their manufacturing facility in Japan, with a full supply chain story telling the consumer that McDonald's uses Australian beef because McDonald's trusts Australian beef, and therefore you can trust McDonald's generally. That tray mat that you see on page there, we've now, in the 2 years following, we printed over 120 million of those tray mats in McDonald's Japan. And that started to help, along with some other initiatives from McDonald's about other, potatoes, lettuce, etc., talking about where they get their food from and trying to rebuild that trust. We were able to start turning around, in partnership with McDonald's, some of that trust reputation. More recently, we brought McDonald's Japan out to Australia to shoot a TV commercial which, along the same lines, helps rebuild trust in McDonald's by using the trust that consumers have in Australian beef. And I'd like to finish up just by playing that for you.
マクドナルドの 100% 無添加ビーフはたくさんの人の思いでできています。
この大自然が牛を健康に育ててくれるんですよ。
ビーフ 100%、保存料、添加物は使っておりません。
ビーフの美味しさを引き立てるメニュー作りを日々心がけています。
100% 無添加ビーフを作っているのは
私です。
私です。私です。
私です。
私です。
マクドナルドはこだわり続けます。すべてがお客様のスマイルにつながるから。
So that was probably the biggest campaign out of all brands in Japan last year. It was saturation coverage on national media throughout the last quarter and first quarter of this year. And I think that's just one example of how we can leverage the trust that we've built over the decades in our industry with large customers who have large media budgets and want to help tell a story about Australian beef to their customers. And that's sort of seen as repeated across the globe in many of our markets globally, where we work with customers to tell a story that helps them grow sales. And our third speaker today, Lockie Graham, will have a good story about how he's been able to grow his own brand. But for now, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Andrew Robb.